A flight attendant tried to restrain a black CEO, but he calmly documented the entire incident, turning it into a decisive piece of evidence against the crew. A flight attendant duct-taped the black CEO to the window seat, thinking no one would challenge him. He didn't realize the CEO was already recording everything, ready to tape the whole trial. Subscribe if you believe arrogance always collapses when true authority is prepared. You think a title protects you at 30,000 feet. The words weren't loud, but they were sharp enough to pierce through the quiet hum of Halvex Flight 308's cabin. Dr. Kyren Vallis looked up from his tablet, his stylus hovering above a slide labeled Vallis Framework, Tier 4 compliance mapping. The tension between him and the man standing over him was palpable, an aggressive stillness that didn't belong in any aisle of any aircraft. Senior Flight Attendant Brennick Korr stood just inches from Kyren's face, his breath deliberate, his stance wider than necessary. The glint of a security override band blinked faintly from his wrist, and his narrowed eyes held something colder than authority, contempt. Kyren blinked slowly, calmly. "Excuse me," he said, voice even, laced with the kind of restraint that had won him international contracts, boardroom battles, and legislative respect. He was no stranger to pressure, but this wasn't pressure. This was performance. 10 minutes earlier, as the aircraft had taxied from the gate, Kyren had dutifully placed his metal briefcase, steel gray, fingerprint locked, no labels, into the overhead bin after being loudly accused by Brennick of refusing to comply. In reality, Kyren hadn't even been addressed until the flight attendant's voice boomed through the aisle. Passengers in nearby rows had turned to glance, confused by the outburst, then returned to their books, snacks, or cabin silence. Only one remained alert. The man in 2A, who, without a word, subtly angled his phone camera between the seats and hit record. Kyren had not been in the mood to escalate. He had too much to lose, too close to the finish line. The Air and Tech Tribunal was just hours away, and his entire team was counting on his presence to ratify the most pivotal compliance framework in Aeronova Systems history. The licensing deal he'd just secured, $600 million in ethics-based AI modules, was meaningless if he didn't deliver the regulatory vote in person. But Brennick wasn't backing off. His posture now signaled something more than irritation. It hinted at orchestration. He tapped his wrist device again, the square labeled Zone 2 override, briefly flashing blue before going dim. Kyren hadn't seen it, but 2A had. And the passenger's expression changed, subtle but not dismissible. He leaned slightly forward, as though mentally filing a timestamp. The cabin lights dimmed as the aircraft entered final taxi position. The intercom crackled, and the captain's voice, routine, disinterested, announced takeoff in 5 minutes. Brennick didn't move. "You've interfered with a federal cabin procedure," Brennick said flatly. "There is no such procedure regarding briefcase placement unless obstructing," Kyren responded, unbothered. "I placed it where instructed." "But you delayed," Brennick snapped. "And passengers like you like to bend lines until they break." That was the moment Kyren realized this wasn't about rules. It was about roles. And someone wanted to redefine his. He sat upright. "If this is about power, you've picked the wrong passenger," he said quietly, not out of anger, but precision. His tone wasn't raised. It didn't need to be. But Brennick smirked as if that was the cue he'd been waiting for. He turned to the row behind them and spoke just loud enough for others to hear. "We've got a situation with passenger 2B, marked non-compliant." That word again. Kyren felt a flicker of heat behind his ears, but his hands remained still. He glanced to his left, toward the man in 2A. Their eyes met for the first time. The stranger's gaze was neutral but focused, not curious, not nosy, just awake. Then, without warning, Brennick leaned down, his lips dangerously close to Kyren's ear. "Out here," he whispered, "your suit, your title, your fake calm, they don't mean anything. You're not in a boardroom." Kyren's jaw flexed, but he said nothing. The lights above flickered as the aircraft eased toward the runway. A few overhead bins clicked from turbulence vibrations. A baby in row 6 started fussing. From the corner of his vision, Kyren noticed the briefcase. His briefcase had been nudged halfway out of the bin, handle dangling. He stood to secure it, but Brennick stepped forward, blocking the aisle. "Sit down." I said sit." Kyren paused. "Saturday." Lifted his tablet, breathed in slowly. The intercom chimed again. "Cabin secure," said a second voice, another crew member. They didn't sound confident. Brennick took 2 steps back, eyes never leaving Kyren. "Let's see how compliant you stay at altitude," he said. The plane began its roll. Kyren gripped the armrest. He was used to turbulence. But this time, the shaking wasn't just underfoot. Behind him, too, he subtly adjusted the angle of his phone. Kyren had no idea the seatbelt sign would become a weapon. The cabin jolted with a sudden patch of turbulence, sharp enough to rattle overhead compartments and stir unease in the passengers. The seatbelt sign blinked overhead, dinging once, twice, as passengers shifted in their seats. Most took it as routine. But for Brennick Korr, it was a curtain rising on a performance he had choreographed from the start. He emerged from the galley with mechanical precision, carrying a sealed black pouch tucked beneath one arm and a hardened expression that left no room for questions. His voice rang out across the cabin, louder than necessary. "Passenger 2B has been identified as a safety threat. Compliance procedures will be enacted." The words cracked through the quiet like a dropped plate. Kyren Vallis, seated in 2B beside the window, looked up in disbelief. His posture had been composed, his tablet tucked away neatly, his briefcase stowed after the earlier confrontation. "Excuse me?" Kyren asked, calm but alert. Brennick ignored the question. Instead, he unclipped the pouch, pulled out a thick roll of industrial-grade duct tape, and turned to the 2 younger male attendants trailing behind him. They both hesitated at the sight of the tape, exchanging uncertain glances. "Security compliance override. Execute," Brennick barked. Kyren stood, refusing to raise his voice. "I haven't violated any safety instruction. I asked to speak with the captain immediately." But Brennick's next move wasn't verbal. He shoved Kyren back into his seat with a sharp, practiced motion. The table clattered downward. One of Kyren's hands went instinctively to the armrest, but before he could fully resist, the tape hissed and snapped across his forearm, pinning it to the armrest like a restraint in a chair designed for interrogation. The man in 2A, stoic, observant, seated quietly since boarding, leaned in without making eye contact. His voice was low but steady. "Don't fight. Document." Kyren didn't need more. With a discreet turn of his head, he blinked twice. His voice-activated glasses responded with a soft chime only he could hear. The recording began, live-streaming directly to Aeronova's legal compliance server. What was once a simple precaution had now become his only defense. Brennick crouched at Kyren's side and continued wrapping the tape, spiraling it around his wrist, then pressing it hard beneath the window frame, anchoring it against the cold metal. Kyren's breath tightened, not in fear but in measured control. The lights overhead flickered slightly with more turbulence, and a hush crept into the rows around him. No one moved, but everyone watched. "Sir," Kyren said again, but Brennick was already unrolling a second strip, this time pulling a folded cloth from the pouch, holding it with a clinical detachment. Without warning, he pressed the cloth over Kyren's mouth and taped it in place with 2 swift layers, silencing any further protest. A badge slid from Kyren's lap and clinked against the floor. It landed face up. Dr. Kyren Vallis, CEO, Aeronova Systems. The light caught the etched lettering as Brennick glanced down. He paused for half a second. A flicker of recognition passed across his features, but he sneered and turned away, refusing to acknowledge what he'd seen. Across the aisle, one of the flight attendants mouthed something to the other. Did he just gag him? But neither stepped forward. Fear, or confusion, had frozen their judgment. 3 rows behind, a boy in row 4, no older than 15, slowly raised a phone beneath the shadow of his hoodie. His hands trembled slightly as he hit record. The red circle pulsed. The screen framed Kyren, gagged and bound to his seat, staring at the horizon through the window he was now part of. A man stripped of motion, but not of awareness. The man in 2A, calm as ever, tilted his phone just enough to maintain a wide shot. His lens captured everything: Brennick's towering posture, the flash of the duct tape roll, the cloth tightening over Kyren's face. His thumb hovered over the upload button, then pressed. A few rows back, a low murmur began, a sound that traveled seat to seat like the flicker of a slow-burning fuse. No one stood. No one shouted. But something had shifted. Kyren's breath came slow through his nose, deliberate and measured. He leaned his head back against the stiff seat, watching Brennick walk away with theatrical finality. Footsteps thudded lightly on the carpeted aisle, but Kyren's mind was focused elsewhere, calculating, recording, remembering. Foreshadowing sharpened in the silence. Brennick believed he had won, that a display of dominance at 30,000 feet would go unquestioned, that procedure could be faked, that passengers were powerless if bound with the illusion of authority. But behind eyes shielded by tinted glasses, Kyren was already writing the next chapter. The boy in row 4 stared at a screen. Upload complete. 10 seconds later, his phone buzzed. 3 notifications. 5 retweets. A comment: "What airline is this?" The man in 2, leaned his head just slightly toward Kyren, his voice low again. This is going to end very differently than he thinks. Brennick had just bound his own downfall. Kyren Vallis sat taped to the aircraft window, his breath slowing not from calm, but from calculation. The adhesive tightened with every shallow inhale, pulling against the hairs on his wrist and the soft skin just below the sleeve of his suit. His left arm was fused to the armrest. The silver tape stretched tightly across muscle and bone, while the right was fastened beneath the window ledge with an extra wrap that Brennick had smugly declared company protocol. It wasn't. Kyren knew that, and so did Brennick. But truth at 39,000 feet meant nothing unless it had a witness or a wire. The cloth gag across Kyren's mouth had begun to dry at the corners, leaving behind a bitter taste of synthetic fiber and silence. The man in 2, glanced sideways every so often, phone still angled discreetly, thumb occasionally tapping the screen to adjust focus. Kyren didn't know his name. He didn't need to. The man's presence had become an anchor, an unspoken confirmation that what was happening wasn't just humiliating. It was evidence. Brennick passed again, his boots clicking with exaggerated weight against the aisle floor. He paused, leaned slightly, and looked down at Kyren like a museum exhibit. "How's the view, sir?" he said, with the kind of smile meant to belittle. "Federal restraint protocols, designed for passenger safety." His voice rose slightly at the end, a performative gesture toward the cabin, as if daring anyone to object. None did. Not allowed. But the murmurs had started, low, confused, spreading like static behind closed mouths. Kyren turned his head slightly, the edge of the tape pulling against his cheek. He couldn't speak, but his eyes met Brennick's without flinching. Behind the lenses of his voice-activated glasses, the recording continued. No blink, no pause. Every frame uploaded in real time to Aeronova Systems' legal server, where compliance advisor Lennox Vale stared at the stream in stunned silence, phone already pressed to his ear. "He's taped," Lennox said flatly to the firm's Federal Transit Council. "He's actually taped to the seat. That's a felony." Back in the cabin, the boy in row 4 hunched beneath a dark hoodie, arms folded across the tray table. He held his phone low, camera app open, lens focused just past the aisle. His fingers moved quickly, not just filming but uploading. The thumbnail on his screen froze on a single frame. Kyren, bound, silent, eyes narrowed like a man who'd memorized every detail of the ceiling panel above him. The caption he typed was simple. "They taped the CEO of Aeronova. Share before they delete it." A ripple moved through the passengers, as if the cabin itself sensed an incoming shift. A man in row 9, tall, silver-haired, with a steady posture that didn't quite fit with tourist leisure, rose quietly. Without drawing attention, he approached the nearest crew member and handed over a folded slip of paper. "Kindly deliver this to your lead attendant," he said. "No emotion, just certainty." The crew member hesitated but obeyed. The note made its way to Brennick, who unfolded it with theatrical flourish. His eyes scanned it, then he let out a dry laugh. Tribunal protocol, he scoffed, crumpling it in his palm. You passengers have been watching too many shows. He tucked the note into his pocket and continued down the aisle as if nothing had happened. But he hadn't recognized the name on the note, Taryn Halst. Nor had he registered the embedded security watermark identifying the bearer as an Aerotech Independent Tribunal liaison. Halst had recognized Kyren the moment he boarded, and he had already sent a secure relay through his encrypted tablet to the Aerotech Ethics Board. The relay included timestamps, photo captures, and a preliminary violation flag. Back at Aeronova headquarters, Lennox barked orders across 2 departments while staff frantically routed the footage to external counsel. Do not delay. Start chain of custody documentation now. We're going to need it admissible. In the air, Brennick tapped his wrist device again, causing a faint chime to echo from the overhead speakers. Attention all passengers, he said, his voice amplified with casual tyranny. Due to continued non-compliance, this individual has been visually restrained for your safety. If any other passenger chooses to disregard flight crew instructions, similar action will be taken. He didn't name Kyren. He didn't need to. Every pair of eyes had already locked on the man in the charcoal gray suit. The man who hadn't raised his voice, hadn't fought back, hadn't even moved. But now, his fingers slowly curled beneath the pressure of the tape. Subtle, deliberate, as if reminding himself that even bound muscle could still resist. The man in 2A leaned forward and spoke for the first time in nearly an hour, his voice low and sharp with clarity. Don't fight, he whispered. Document. Kyren didn't blink. He simply tilted his chin, barely enough to signal acknowledgement. Then, with a soft inhale through his nose, he shifted the angle of his face just enough that the embedded glasses caught Brennick's next trip down the aisle head-on. His voice remained silent, but his mind turned steadily. Taryn Halst watched all of it from row 9. His tablet now displayed the blinking confirmation of transmission receipt. The ethics board had read his relay. 1 row forward, the boy in the hoodie finished his upload. Within seconds, his post was reshared by a regional journalist who recognized Kyren's face. Comments flooded in. Outrage multiplied. The stream was now moving faster than the aircraft. The duct tape, once meant to bind a man in silence, had done something else entirely. It had wrapped itself around the conscience of everyone watching. By the time they crossed state lines, the tape had already gone vira. The first jolt of turbulence shook the cabin like a warning. Luggage shifted overhead. Ice rattled in cups. Passengers braced, and for a few seconds, all eyes turned to the fastened seatbelt sign as it blinked urgently above them. But that wasn't where the real disturbance had begun. In row 2, Kyren Vallis remained bound, the industrial-grade tape stiff across his chest and arms, the folded cloth still affixed to his mouth like a gag from another era. He stared ahead with unsettling calm, his voice-activated glasses continuing their silent broadcast. Unbeknownst to the crew, the stream had already surpassed 2 million live views in under 40 minutes. It had spread like fire in dry air, from Aeronova headquarters to legal teams to newsrooms to the boardroom of the Aerotech Ethics Tribunal itself. At that very moment, in a sleek marble chamber in Lornfield, the Aerotech board had been halfway through a procedural vote to delay Kyren's compliance framework proposal when an assistant rushed in, tablet in hand, breathless. Sir, he said, turning toward Judge Rellenmayer, the lead tribunal chair, I think you need to see this. On screen, the live feed showed Kyren in his seat, taped, gagged, unmoving. Rellen blinked. You're telling me this happened today? No, sir. It's happening now. Back aboard Halvex Flight 308. Another ripple of motion broke through the cabin. Taryn Halst, seated in row 9, stood. His movements were unhurried, deliberate. He stepped into the aisle with the posture of a man who did not need to be loud to be noticed. He removed a slim leather wallet from his coat and approached the galley partition where a junior attendant stood, trying to steady his footing against the turbulence. I need to speak to the captain, Taryn said evenly. Under Flight Integrity Clause 4.2. The attendant paled. That clause was almost never invoked by passengers. It was a legal provision reserved for cases involving in-flight abuse, sabotage, or system-level breaches. I'll get him, the attendant stammered, disappearing toward the cockpit without another word. When Captain Velric Dane emerged moments later, the temperature in the cabin dropped perceptibly. He was not a man easily rattled, but what he saw in row 2 stopped him cold. His steps slowed. His eyes took in Kyren's bound arms, the gag, the silver glint of tape running beneath the window's metal frame. He froze. Brennick Korr met him halfway down the aisle, his body tense, mouth already forming excuses. "Captain," Brennick said quickly, "this is a confirmed disciplinary override." Passenger refused to comply multiple times. Dispatch flagged him as a pre-risk. "I executed protocol." The captain didn't blink. "Show me the override." Brennick tapped the small black square on his wrist monitor. "Zone 2 override, security tier flag 18. Justified under emergency subrule. Who issued it?" The captain asked quietly, cutting him off. The silence that followed was louder than any shouting match. Brennick hesitated. That pause alone cracked the illusion. I received it via system relay just before taxi. "No override has been registered under this flight ID," Velric said, his voice like steel wrapped in frost. "I just checked the logs before stepping out. There is no Zone 2 override. Not in our database. Not in dispatch. Not anywhere." Gasps moved through the cabin like a second wave of turbulence. In his seat, Kyren's head turned, his eyes locking on the captain. Calmly, without needing to raise his voice, he leaned forward as far as the restraints allowed. The cloth gag had begun to peel slightly from the condensation of his breath. "Would you like to hear the rest of the recording, Captain?" he said clearly through the loosened gag. The cockpit went silent except for one word. "Play it." Captain Velric Dane stood stiff near the forward galley, the headset still resting loosely around his neck. The cabin had gone quiet, save for the low hum of engines and the occasional overhead ding. A thin thread of tension ran through the aisle as he listened, unblinking, to the audio playing directly from Dr. Kyren Vallis's voice-activated glasses. For 7 minutes, no one moved. Every second of the footage was damning. Brennick Korr's voice barked in escalating aggression, demanding compliance with made-up orders, misusing safety terms, dismissing Kyren's legal badge as if it were lint. The captain heard Kyren calmly ask for clarification, heard him request to speak to the cockpit multiple times, each one denied. He heard the words, "You think a title protects you at 30,000 feet?" He heard the rough crinkle of duct tape. He heard the cloth gag pressed down. But worse, he heard silence from the other crew, the quiet complicity of those who should have intervened. When the final line played, Brennick muttering, "He won't say a word now," the captain clicked the audio off. For a heartbeat, the only sound was the steady blink of the overhead light. Then Captain Velric straightened. "I'm initiating Article 7.3, he said, his voice cold and precise. "Cabin misconduct escalation." Brennick, who had been hovering behind with arms folded, laughed nervously. "You're making a mistake, sir. This was a protocol issue. Security override. You just assaulted a federal witness." Velric cut in, turning slowly toward him. The words landed like thunder. Every nearby passenger leaned slightly closer. Someone near the rear dropped a metal thermos with a hollow clink. Brennick's face drained of color. He refused to follow. There was an interference flag, he stammered, gesturing toward his wrist device as if it might back him up. From 3 rows back, Terran Hall stood. The quiet man who had watched everything with unsettling calm stepped forward and extended a narrow black folder toward the captain. "Tribunal liaison clearance," Terran said, his voice firm. "You'll find I'm authorized under Regulation 5.11 to confirm the legal identity of Dr. Vallis and intervene if harm to tribunal-bound passengers occurs." The captain took the folder and skimmed the laminated ID inside. His eyebrows rose. Terran added, "You should know this incident was relayed to the Aerotech Ethics Board 20 minutes ago. They've already suspended Corvex's security integration privileges." Brennick took a step back, but Velric held up a hand to stop him. "Remain where you are," he ordered, then turned toward the forward galley phone. "Contact ground. Prepare for incident-level docking on arrival," at Cauldron International. Dispatch Federal Marshals. In row 4, the boy with the hoodie tapped upload on his screen. His video, now titled Black CEO Taped to Window Seat, was already soaring past 5 million views. Across continents, newsrooms scrambled. Alerts flashed. Anchors read live updates in stunned tones. And back at Aeronova Systems, the legal division's emergency lawsuit protocol kicked in automatically. The VP of Legal, Lennox Vale, activated the firm's in-transit litigation framework. Counselors were assembled. Kyren's livestream was already timestamped, verified, and filed for tribunal validation. Captain Velric handed the folder back to Terran, then walked briskly to seat 2B. Kyren hadn't moved. His wrists still bound, his back stiff against the seat, his breathing steady but tight. The cloth gag across his mouth had slipped slightly, but the tape still sealed its corners to his cheek. His glasses, still angled low on his nose, glinted with recording light. The captain knelt beside him. "Dr. Vallis," he said quietly, "you're safe now. I apologize. I should have been told. I should have seen it sooner." Kyren's eyes met his. "No rai, no panique. Just something colder, measured and sharpened by control." Velric stood and addressed one of the attendants nearby, a younger man who had hesitated earlier. "Cut the restraints." The attendant rushed to obey. With trembling fingers, he peeled back the silver tape from Kyren's arms. Skin came up with it. Raw lines etched across the wrist. When the gag was removed, Kyren coughed once, then sat upright, his spine like a rod of steel. He didn't stand right away. He adjusted the cuffs of his suit. He reached calmly for the badge that had slipped to the floor hours ago. Then, in the most composed voice in the cabin, he said, "I'd like a receipt for this incident." Brennick, now backed against the bulkhead, said nothing. The silence pressed against him like a wall. Captain Velric gave a small nod to the same attendant, who reached into the restraint kit and pulled out the final irony, the same roll of tape Brennick had used. Velric held it out toward him. Bind his hands. Same material. No exceptions. The tape hissed, stretched, then looped around Brennick's wrist with a snap. The same smugness that had passed his lips now tightened into a grimace. Murmurs rippled through the cabin, then applause erupted. Some passengers clapped slowly, others with vigor, relief flooding the space like fresh oxygen. Kyren remained still, breathing through his nose, chin slightly raised. Across the aisle, Terran watched him with quiet approval. Behind him, the man in 2A, who had recorded everything, lowered his phone and simply nodded. The tape that tried to silence him had just unspooled an empire-wide reckoning. The cabin doors had barely opened when a uniformed Federal Transit Marshals stepped silently on a Halvex Flight 308. There was no announcement, no alarm, only the hush of tension slicing through the aircraft like a blade through cloth. Senior Flight Attendant Brennick Korr stood near the galley, his spine rigid and his jaw set in a desperate clench. The first marshal, a tall man with a muted silver badge clipped beneath his lapel, gestured toward him without a word. Brennick started to speak, his voice raised with a strained authority. "I was following higher clearance orders," he barked, as if volume could erase the duct tape still scattered across the floor. The marshal's response was mechanical. Step forward. Hands visible. Passengers watched in a stunned, breathless quiet as Brennick was cuffed and led down the aisle. His eyes flicked to Kyren's seat as he passed, the tape now unspooled, the metal briefcase upright beside its owner. Brennick's voice wavered. "You don't understand. I had authorization. There was an override flag. Check dispatch. Check." But the marshals didn't check. The forged override had already been exposed. Kyren Vallis stood next. His limbs were stiff, wrists red with adhesive burns, but his expression was calm. The moment he stepped off the aircraft and onto the jet bridge, the shift was immediate. The sterile silence of the flight gave way to the controlled chaos of press protocols, flashing lenses, and legal choreography. Aeronova's legal PR team had moved fast. Within 30 minutes, they constructed a corridor lined with velvet stanchions and neutral lighting, flanked by media but controlled by security. This wasn't damage control. It was preparation. As Kyren's polished shoes hit the tile of Cauldron International's terminal floor, a volley of questions exploded around him. Dr. Vallis, were you restrained without cause? Do you plan to sue Halvex? Was this racially motivated? Kyren said nothing. His eyes scanned the crowd once, then locked on a federal investigator near the checkpoint, distinguishable by his dark blazer and plain lapel pin. Kyren approached him directly, reached into his jacket, and pulled out a slim thumb drive sealed in a transparent pouch. The entire movement was fluid, practiced, deliberate. Everything you need is on this, Kyren said evenly. The investigator took it without a word, eyes narrowing in recognition. He didn't need to ask what it contained. He had already seen the viral footage. Inside a private terminal conference room, Captain Velric Dane stood at a projection table, his pilot's uniform now stripped of its authority and replaced with weary precision. He scrolled through a tablet, selecting clips, aligning timestamps. His voice was steady but low as he addressed two transit investigators and a compliance officer. "This is Brennick Korr's log," Velric said, tapping the screen. "You'll see there was no real override protocol issued by dispatch. What he cited, Zone 2 clearance flag, does not exist in Halvex's security procedures. It's fabricated." He continued, attaching 5 distinct pieces of footage: Kyren's voice-activated glasses, the 2 passengers recording, the boys' video from row 4 and attendant's body cam feed, and the cabin security log, all forming a narrative impossible to deny. One investigator raised a brow. Who supplied the device on his wrist? Velric hesitated, then dropped the next revelation. That override signal wasn't internal. The wristband was a Corvex Solutions model, one of the operations monitoring tools we discontinued 2 quarters ago due to unresolved ethics complaints. The name hit the room like a dropped pane of glass. Halvex Solutions. Across the city, at Aeronova Systems headquarters, a private conference room buzzed with low voices. Lennox Vale, Kyren's compliance advisor, clicked a remote as a holographic interface floated above the table. The data from the flight had already been processed. Kyren's legal team, engineering analysts, and external risk auditors stared at the network map that bloomed on the screen. "Look here," Lennox said, pointing to a branching signal path. "This is where the override originated. Not from Halvex, not from dispatch, but from a signal port linked to a terminated Corvex server. It bounced off an old relay node they shouldn't even have access to anymore." Kyren, seated at the head of the table, nodded once. "Unseal the Corvex data sync logs," he said. "If they tampered with access, I want the original code traces. Every timestamp, every file ping, and prep the motion to subpoena their archive servers." Back at Aerontech headquarters, the ethics board, once skeptical, even dismissive, was now in frantic session. Their earlier hesitation had dissolved into urgency. The tribunal's internal chat lit up with real-time alerts. Screens displayed footage from the flight, legal memos, and now, a report flagging Corvex as a breach risk under Section 9.7 of the Passenger Rights Convention. The same clause Kyren had fought to reinforce months prior. Judge Rellenmayer, who had quietly opposed Kyren's framework for being overly idealistic, stared at the footage of the duct tape being wrapped across Kyren's mouth. He whispered to no one in particular, "We waited too long." By the time the sun dipped below Cauldron's skyline, a decision had been made. The Aerontech Tribunal issued an emergency recall for all override devices linked to Corvex Solutions. The motion to fast-track Kyren's ethics compliance framework passed unanimously, and a confidential summons was sent to Corvex leadership for formal inquiry. Meanwhile, in a quiet room at the airport, Kyren reviewed a transcript on his tablet. The final log entry from the wrist device showed not only the override code, but a traceable upload directive labeled Z2 Privflaggers exec. That was no accident. It was a manual input. He closed the tablet, leaned back, and exhaled slowly. The tape wasn't just evidence. It was a key that unlocked the entire cover-up. The tribunal chamber was silent, thick with anticipation and the weight of consequence. As the doors opened, Kyren Vallis stepped inside with deliberate calm, his footsteps echoing against the polished marble floor. He wore a navy suit, perfectly tailored, his expression composed but unwavering. Beside him walked his lead counsel, Jarek Dorn, followed by 3 Aeronova compliance officers, each carrying binders, encrypted drives, and transcripts. The gravity of their presence needed no announcement. Across the chamber, Brennick Korr sat hunched between 2 Korvex Solutions representatives, Rand Velker and Darren Vost. Unlike Kyren, Brennick no longer wore the authority of his former uniform. The airline had stripped it within hours of the flight's diversion. Now he sat in civilian attire, fingers twitching near his collar as if still expecting to adjust a badge that was no longer there. The 2 Korvex contractors whispered furiously between themselves, clearly unprepared for the level of scrutiny they were about to face. Tribunal Chair Eldon Marr cleared his throat and opened the proceedings with quiet force. This is not merely an incident. This is a breach of principle. His words landed like a gavel. The atmosphere shifted immediately. Kyren rose without being prompted and approached the presentation console. He inserted a slim drive into the terminal and spoke with measured clarity. This tribunal has seen the in-flight video, but I believe you have not seen the metadata logs from the wrist override device used to initiate the restraint order. He tapped a key, and the projection lit up with a split screen. Video on one side, system logs on the other. A line of hexadecimal code scrolled beside footage of Brennick taping Kyren to the window seat. You'll notice, Kyren continued, that this override was issued at 11:42 a.m. from a device not listed in the Halvex Fleet manifest. The signal was routed through a private relay associated with Korvex Solutions, not the airline's internal compliance server. Chairmar leaned forward, brows narrowing. Are you claiming the device was externally embedded? I'm not claiming it, Kyren replied. I'm proving it. He tapped again. The screen switched to a map showing signal traces from the cabin device to a Korvex satellite node registered under a dormant logistics firm, recently reactivated with funding from a shell company based in Veltrin province. Gasps echoed softly among the tribunal members. The Korvex reps shifted uncomfortably. Rand Velker attempted to object, but Chairmar held up a hand. You'll have your turn. For now, let's allow the witness to complete. Kyren turned back to the panel. This override wasn't just unauthorized. It was part of a larger pattern. My team reviewed 6 recent restraint incidents involving black executives on domestic flights operated by Halvex and its partners. Each was flagged for non-compliance despite no evidence of any real threat. In each case, Korvex override devices were involved. None were properly disclosed to the Aviation Ethics Board. He paused, letting the implications sink in. The man in seat 2A, now standing in a clean black suit near the rear bench, stepped forward when summoned. His name was Darian Mavek. Without notes, he gave his testimony. I sat beside Dr. Vallis on that flight. He complied with every instruction. What I witnessed was not enforcement. It was discomfort enforcement, an attempt to assert control, not preserve safety. His voice was steady, but his jaw flexed with restrained anger. They weren't enforcing safety. They were targeting discomfort. Chairmar scribbled something, then looked toward the right bench of the tribunal. I see Mr. Trask isn't present today. No, sir, the clerk replied. He recused himself this morning. Kyren turned his head, eyes narrowing. Trask, a tribunal member known for his aggressive scrutiny of passenger behavior cases, had long been thought impartial. But Jarek Dorn, Kyren's lawyer, now stood and slid a document to the chair. This morning, we uncovered proof that Councilman Trask held financial interests in Korvex Solutions through a shell firm called Evran Analytics. We request that his prior rulings in related cases be reopened. The chamber erupted. Tribunal members exchanged alarmed glances. One whispered to another, "That's a conflict, possibly criminal." The murmurs grew louder. Chairmar called for order. Enough. He stared down at the docket, then back at Brennick. Mr. Korr, you still have not addressed the origin of your override device. You told the captain it came from dispatch. We have no such record. Brennick stood slowly, his voice tight. I was instructed to follow the clearance on my wrist device. That's all I did. And who issued the clearance? Silence. Kyren stepped forward again. You don't have to answer. The device already did. It synced to your fingerprint and uploaded the transmission logs. He looked directly at the tribunal members. You've been shown the footage. Now you've seen the infrastructure. We aren't just dealing with an individual acting out of line. We're confronting a network engineered to bypass accountability. Chairman leaned back, folding his hands tightly. Behind him, the tribunal screen faded to black, as if the system itself had no more to say. Kyren returned to his seat, composed. Darian Mavek joined him. The Korvex representatives stared at each other, sweat beginning to form at their temples. No verdict had yet been spoken, but the weight of it had already settled into the room like fog. The tribunal realized they weren't judging misconduct. They were sitting in the middle of a manipulated system. The attendant smirked, confident his act would go unpunished, unaware that every move, every word, and every violation had been documented for undeniable proof. If you believe cruelty under privilege always folds when strategy meets evidence, hit subscribe now, because justice never hesitates. The first image that flickered across the screen was blurry, just a boy in a hoodie lifting his phone under the flicker of cabin lights. But what followed seized the internet like a lightning bolt. Within minutes, the footage of Dr. Kyren Vallis bound to his window seat, duct tape constraining his wrists, a cloth gag pressed against his mouth, spread across platforms with a speed that made containment impossible. The headline wrote itself: Black CEO taped mid-flight by rogue flight attendant. By Friday morning, the social media wave had grown into a surge. Hashtags like hashtag tape the CEO and hashtag window justice dominated global feeds. Every major outlet replayed the clip on a loop: Kyren's stillness, the hush in the cabin, the calculated cruelty on Brennick Korr's face. But even as the world shouted in anger, Kyren remained composed, issuing no immediate comments. It wasn't silence, it was precision. At 8:30 a.m., the press received a statement signed personally by Kyren Vallis. Just 2 sentences, but they echoed like thunder through boardrooms and courtrooms alike. This was never about tape. It was about the systems we allow to go unchecked. The statement was followed not by a media tour or a viral interview, but by action. At exactly 9 a.m., Aeronova Systems announced the official launch of the Vallis Initiative, a sweeping, multi-tiered legal and regulatory platform designed to identify, track, and dismantle covert coercion mechanisms embedded within modern transit systems. A synchronized press conference streamed across multiple time zones. Lennox Vale, Kyren's lead compliance officer, stood at the podium. "This is not a reaction," he said. "This is a framework. For every passenger who's been restrained, silenced, flagged, or quietly removed under vague security reasons, this initiative is your instrument of defense." Behind him, a graphic unfolded: case tracking portals, incident response teams, legal rapid review systems, and a new digital infrastructure for lodging anonymous restraint abuse complaints, all protected under federal data law. Aeronova pledged $12 million in startup capital for the initiative. The board vote had been unanimous. Simultaneously, and with little media notice, federal investigators arrived at the towering black glass headquarters of Korvex Solutions with sealed warrants in hand. Inside their sub-level archives, agents uncovered a classified folder titled TRP Protocols. The acronym stood for Target Response Profiles. Within those files were hundreds of digital entries, each detailing how to visually flag, pressure escalate, or coerce de-escalation through compliance restraint. Each profile was color-coded. The red-coded files, investigators noticed grimly, were disproportionately linked to passengers of color. The lead agent, Marshall Dellen Roque, stood in silence as his team extracted the database. "This wasn't safety enforcement," he muttered. "This was social profiling dressed as protocol." Meanwhile, at the Air and Tech Tribunal Hall, another moment was unfolding, broadcast live to a stunned international audience. Kyren Vallis sat composed beneath the tribunal lights, the same posture he held mid-flight, only now with a mic in front of him instead of a gag. The Korvex legal chief, an older man with graying temples and a steel blue tie, tried to distance himself from the TRP revelations, claiming they were departmental prototypes never meant for operational use. Kyren leaned forward. The room went still. "How many people?" he asked slowly, clearly. "Did you tape before someone taped back?" Silence. The Corvex chief blinked, mouth slightly parted. Cameras from 3 different angles captured the pause. Tribunal members froze. One looked visibly ill. Kyren didn't move. He didn't need to. The silence stretched for 5 seconds, then 10, then 20. Across living rooms, conference tables, train stations, and courtrooms, millions of viewers leaned in, not to the screen, but to the pause itself. It was heavier than any argument. It was proof. 18 million viewers watched that moment live. Within hours, news anchors dissected it. Analysts froze the footage, highlighting the micro-expressions of the Corvex team. Legal scholars cited it as the most potent use of quiet confrontation in tribunal history. In classrooms, professors began referring to it as the Vallis question. And inside Aeronova's main server hub, engineers quietly added that footage to the initiative's public archive, filing it under the title TQ-0001, Tape Question, First Use. The duct tape, once meant to bind and humiliate, had become something far more powerful. It had become a mirror, reflecting a culture too used to restraint without reason. The tribunal gavel struck once, echoing through the vaulted chamber with a finality that turned every breath into silence. The tribunal rules in favor of Dr. Kyren Vallis, Chair Eldonmar declared, his voice low but unshakable. The sentence alone didn't need elaboration. The ripple effect began instantly. Contract dissolutions, internal audits, federal penalties, all triggered by those words. Kyren remained seated for a moment, absorbing the verdict like a man surfacing from deep water. Around him, his legal team exchanged glances of vindication. On the far bench, Brennick Korr sat rigid, his face blank, as if waiting for a different reality to interrupt this one. He had no attorney beside him now. Only 2 silent contract representatives from Corvex Solutions who were already slipping away from him as if he were a stain they'd tried too late to scrub out. The chair continued. This tribunal finds Corvex Solutions in violation of Section 14.6 and 19.2 of ethical compliance for unauthorized behavioral enforcement mechanisms. All existing contracts are suspended pending federal investigation. He turned a page with deliberate care. Furthermore, Halvex Airlines is ordered to release all override-related incidents to the public within 10 business days and is fined $85 million for systemic negligence. The silence that followed was not disbelief, it was recalibration. The room, filled with policymakers, aviation reformists, and ethics liaisons, understood what had just occurred. It wasn't just a ruling, it was a tectonic shift. And Kyren Vallis had become its axis. A day later, the symbolism could not have been clearer. The same gate, the same airline, the same seat, 2B. But this time, Kyren stepped onto the aircraft not as a restrained passenger, but as the architect of a reform that had just been written into federal aviation law. His presence was calm, composed, yet crackling with purpose. Every passenger seemed to recognize him, not by fame, but by something deeper, respect born of resilience. Taryn Halst, wearing a sharp gray coat and holding a slim digital tablet, walked just behind him. Captain Velric Dane, reinstated and commended for his mid-flight intervention, stood at the cockpit door, nodding once as Kyren passed. Neither man said anything yet. They didn't need to. Words were for justification. Today was about witness. As Kyren settled into his seat, his fingers brushed against a small new addition on the tray table. A brushed steel plaque, no larger than a business card, was affixed with care. Its inscription, etched in black enamel, read, "You are not property. You are presence." Kyren ran his thumb gently across the words. Then he leaned back, exhaled, and closed his eyes for a moment, not to rest, but to reset. Everything had changed since the day he had been taped here like a threat. That tape, once a symbol of humiliation, was now preserved in a sealed archive at the Aerotech Tribunal Hall. The cabin filled slowly. As the boarding announcement concluded, a man stepped into view at the front of the plane. He was older, his gait deliberate, a slight hitch in his left knee as he walked. Kyren opened his eyes and turned slightly. The man paused by seat 2, adjusted the lapel of his navy coat, and gave a quiet nod. Kyren returned it without speaking. The man, once a silent witness on the flight, now wore a pin on his chest shaped like an open eye, the insignia of the newly formed Oversight Committee for Passenger Ethics. He took his seat next to Kyren as if it had always been his place, as if some cycle had been completed. A few rows behind, a reporter whispered into her recorder. She had managed to slip aboard under press credentials, notepad clenched in her lap like a lifeline. "Mr. Vallis," she asked softly, just loud enough for the question to carry, "after everything that happened, would you fly again?" Kyren didn't turn. His gaze remained on the plaque. "Only if they know I'm taping," he replied, voice even. The plane began to taxi. Outside, the sky was clear, no turbulence in sight. But inside the aviation industry, a storm had passed, and in its wake, blueprints were being redrawn. Across terminals, carriers, and executive suites, things shifted. Tape kits were removed. Override systems underwent rigorous scrutiny. Protocol manuals, long left untouched, were rewritten line by line. The CEO, who was taped to the window, had just taped a new world into motion. The council chamber had not yet quieted when Kyren Vallis stepped to the center dais. He didn't wait for applause, nor did he acknowledge the flashes of press lenses trained on him from the balcony rail. Instead, he placed a slim matte folder on the polished podium and opened directly with, "3 weeks ago, we thought we solved it." Heads turned. The counselors of the Unified Transit Reform Council, seated in an arc of curved mahogany desks, straightened visibly. Some expected a policy update. Others anticipated closing remarks on the tribunal case that had stunned the entire aviation industry. But what Kyren unfolded instead was another fracture, deeper, darker. The Vallis Initiative has completed its first audit cycle. He continued, his voice steady, but sharpened with purpose. 7 carriers, 12 monitored routes, real-time escalation flagging, immediate anomaly capture. The system works. But the system didn't see everything. A large screen behind him lit up with infrared footage, grainy, time-stamped, soundless. It showed a flight crew restraining a man with silver tape. The man wasn't Kyren. He wasn't even American. This was taken 8 days ago on a carrier operating under Veltric Innovations, Kyren explained. A subcontractor to Corvex Solutions. A murmur rippled through the chamber. Counselor Ben Solt leaned forward. "Veltric? I thought Corvex had its contract suspended." "They did," Kyren replied, flipping to the next slide. "But not before licensing their override signal tech to Veltric Innovations, who rebranded the kits and sold them overseas as passive neutralization devices. These devices are active now, on flights with no oversight, on passengers with no voice." He paused, letting the image settle. The man in the video, eyes wide, arms bound, looked eerily similar to Kyren's own viral image. "We found 7 instances, 3 in nations with no aviation ombudsman, 2 flagged as crew discretion events, 1 recorded by a journalist who was later detained. Another slide, another restrained passenger, different airline, same tape, same wrist device blinking in the crew member's hand." The chamber darkened. The truth hung in the air like a dropped gavel. "You're telling us this continued after the ruling?" asked Counselor Jarek Hain, his voice hushed. Kyren looked up. "No, I'm telling you it expanded. Because systems like this don't die when you expose them. They move. They rename themselves." He reached into his case and pulled a marked circuit board. "This is the override module, pulled from a decommissioned Veltric unit. Same base coding as the Corvex prototype, only with the compliance log stripped." Counselor Marnell Orst, who had sat silent until now, stood slowly. Why didn't this surface during the tribunal? Kyren stepped around the dais, holding the board out like evidence. Because only the bound man has incentive to pull back the curtain. You don't search for hidden chains unless you've worn one. For a moment, no one moved. The chamber lights faded slightly as the footage looped again, this time side by side with Kyren's original recording. 2 frames, 2 men, same restraint, different continents. A hush fell across the rows of aides and press observers. Counselor Orst sat down without another word. The chair of the council, Eldon Ferris, cleared his throat. Mr. Vallis, what do you propose? Kyren looked at them all, eyes unblinking. We open a cross-border reform dialogue immediately. Not next month. Not next session. Now, we draft new verification mandates for every override-capable device. We define what qualifies as restraint, and we ensure every carrier, subcontractor, and supplier is held to a uniform global standard. Ferris folded his hands. Do you have the framework? Kyren tapped the folder. It's already written. The chair glanced at the council, then nodded. Then it will be entered into review today. As aides moved swiftly to photocopy the document, Kyren stepped away from the podium and faced the screen one last time. Dramatic irony crackled beneath the silence. Brennick's act, so small in intention, so targeted in malice, had not only backfired. It had unraveled something global. As Kyren left the chamber, reporters shouted for comments, but he kept walking. He had already said the most important thing. What was supposed to be tape on skin had become ink in history. The gavel struck once in the narrow-paneled courtroom of Norwich Province, echoing too sharply for the room's size. Across the aisle, Kyren Vallis stood beside his attorney, arms calmly crossed, eyes scanning the faces of the private audience. Journalists kept out, cameras forbidden, but tension unmistakably thick. On the opposite side, a coalition of gray-suited men shifted with barely contained arrogance. Former Corvex shareholders, ousted security consultants, and 2 men whose faces had once flashed across cabin monitors as enforcement strategists. They'd resurfaced with one goal: to undo what Kyren had set in motion. Mr. Vallis, the judge began, voice low and weathered. This court is reviewing a petition suggesting that your live-stream recording of airline crew constituted a violation of procedural confidentiality under civil statute. Kyren didn't flinch. He knew this was theater. The smear campaign had been building for a week, an orchestrated counterstrike, built not on fact but fear. Fear that his initiative had gone too far. That transparency had upset too many silent agreements. They claim your use of real-time surveillance, without explicit consent, compromised federally protected crew protocol. The judge continued, tapping the folder before him. How do you respond? Kyren's attorney, Malcolm Trin, nodded once. But Kyren raised a hand gently and spoke himself. I respond with 3 facts, Kyren said, voice composed, yet firm. 1. The footage was recorded in a public aircraft cabin, visible to all passengers. 2. The incident involved unlawful physical restraint. And 3. He paused, eyes cutting across the aisle. It was streamed directly to our corporate compliance server, as authorized by our emergency risk mitigation policy. Nothing was hidden. Murmurs stirred in the backbenches. One of the coalition men, a pale executive named Vern Halder, leaned toward his partner, whispering urgently. The judge adjusted his glasses, but said nothing. Kyren stepped forward, pulling a small sealed envelope from his briefcase. This, he said, is a sworn affidavit from the original lead engineer who designed the override device at the heart of this case. The room sharpened. I'll allow it, the judge said slowly, glancing over his glasses. Malcolm passed the envelope to the bailiff. Within moments, the contents were handed to the judge, who flipped it open and froze. A full-page notarized statement, accompanied by schematics and tamper logs. Kyren continued speaking, tone controlled, yet unshakably confident. The engineer, Mr. Duran Malice, testifies that the override device was never approved for deployment. He confirms that the version used by Mr. Brennick Korr was a tampered prototype, extracted from his lab without his consent, modified by a third party, and installed on a non-secure wrist unit. The judge's brow furrowed. He turned the affidavit sideways, then slowly back again, eyes scanning the signatures. Furthermore, Kyren said, his voice tightening with gravity, Mr. Malice identified the exact firmware checksum mismatch that proves post-lab manipulation. That override was never legal, and every incident it triggered stands on compromised ground. The coalition's lead representative stood abruptly. Your Honor, this is a distraction. We are here to debate the legality of real-time cabin recordings, not to retry engineering integrity. Sit down, the judge snapped. His voice, though gravelly, cracked through the courtroom like a fire whip. You brought this claim to discredit a man's integrity. He brought evidence that discredits your foundation. This is not a diversion. This is dismantlement. Silence. The courtroom, dimly lit by long rectangular skylights, seemed to bend inward. Even the dust hanging in the shafts of morning light stilled. For a moment, no one moved. The judge looked at Kyren, then at Malcolm, then again at the affidavit in his hand. This court finds no merit in the petitioner's claims. Furthermore, the evidence submitted suggests the petition was not just baseless, but retaliatory. Case dismissed. The sound was final. The gavel struck twice. The coalition didn't rise. They didn't speak. They sat like toppled statues. Men who had spent fortunes building mechanisms to control narratives, now undone by a single document and a man who refused to bend. As Kyren gathered his belongings, his eyes met the judge's once more. You'll be filing counterclaims? The judge asked quietly, almost as an afterthought. Malcolm nodded. Already submitted. Defamation, targeted harassment, and endangerment of whistleblower protections under the Vallis Initiative's active charter. Good, the judge said, folding his hands. Make sure they understand one thing. This courtroom may be small, but it's not blind. Outside, the air was cold but dry. Kyren stepped into the sunlight, feeling neither triumph nor relief, only clarity. A young reporter across the street called his name, but Kyren kept walking down the courthouse steps toward the waiting car. He didn't need to speak. The verdict had done enough. That afternoon, the injunction was granted. Not just for Kyren, but for all future whistleblowers working within the Vallis Initiative's framework. The ruling would be cited in 12 federal agencies by week's end. The smear campaign died that night. They tried to chain the truth to courtroom walls. But Kyren had already made it walk free. The door clicked shut behind him, cutting off the last echoes of conversation from the corridor outside Aeronova's executive summit room. Kyren Vallis didn't wait for pleasantries. The safeguard chip, he began, placing a sleek black folder at the center of the polished oak conference table. It's ready. Around him, a dozen men, engineers, legal advisors, compliance officers, sat straighter, their faces tight with uncertainty. The air was sharp with tension, the kind that hung in the wake of upheaval. A digital display at the far wall still looped muted news footage from the tribunal. Kyren, seated upright, restrained, staring forward. The image had become a symbol across the industry, but Kyren was not here for symbols. He was here for architecture. One of the engineers, a wiry man named Brennick Korr, leaned forward. You're proposing another tracking protocol, embedded in every crew badge. Real-time audit, instant sync with federal compliance. Sir, we're talking about watching the watchers. That's a political firestorm. Kyren met his gaze without blinking. It's not surveillance, he said. It's transparency. A beat passed. Then another voice from the legal side, older and cautious, Laron Marin, Aeronova's longtime contract advisor. The unions will call it coercion. Carriers will call it expensive. The regulators they'll listen. Kyren interrupted, voice calm but firm, because the tape already spoke. The industry's in retreat mode. This is the window, before the panic closes into denial. Silence deepened. Outside, wind stirred the tinted glass of the boardroom windows, casting fractured reflections of the men around the table, faces etched with duty, doubt, and something else. The weight of knowing they stood on the edge of systemic change. Do we have a prototype? Someone finally asked. Kyren nodded. 2. Piloting begins next week. Select carriers. Narrow routes. Tamper-proof logs. No internal access once sealed. Each event trigger instantly syncs to oversight. No errores. No false overrides. No more duct tape without accountability. He tapped the folder twice. 83%, Kyren added. That's the drop in incident reports from early simulations using controlled crews with the chip badge. A murmur of disbelief rippled through the room. That can't be right, said Brennick. It is, Kyren said. Because the moment they knew they were accountable, they chose restraint. Real restraint. Not tape. Not silence. Integrity. Still, the hesitation lingered. Years of protocol inertia, contractor corruption, and fear-based training didn't vanish in one meeting. Kyren saw it in their eyes. The scars weren't just his. He exhaled quietly, adjusted the single cufflink that had remained loose since the tribunal. I'm not asking for applause, he said. I'm asking for alignment. Quiet execution. Let the system catch up later. There was no vote, just a nod from Laron. Then another, and another. The motion moved. Within 3 weeks, the passenger safeguard chip had launched on 2 regional carriers under pilot scrutiny. Anonymous data, live feedback loops, zero tolerance for tampering. Crew behavior improved overnight. Escalation rates dropped. Most astonishingly, passenger anxiety reports, collected through post-flight surveys, fell to record lows. Kyren said nothing to the press. No interviews. No panels. Not even at the reform summits. Instead, he returned to what he considered real progress. In a quiet office just off the main terminal, Kyren waited. The door opened gently, and a young boy, no more than 14, entered with wide eyes and a wrinkled hoodie. He looked older than he had 3 months ago, back when he had slouched in row 4 and recorded a moment that shook an empire. Sit, Kyren said gently, gesturing to the seat across from him. The boy sat stiffly, unsure whether to be proud, nervous, or both. You changed the story, Kyren said. Before anyone else even knew there was one. The boy looked down, scratching at the edge of his sleeve. I didn't mean to change everything, he murmured. I just knew what was wrong. Kyren studied him for a moment. There was no bravado in the kid's voice. No self-importance. Just clarity. The kind of clarity grown men often lost. A smile tugged gently at the corner of Kyren's mouth. Sometimes that's all history needs, he said. And as the boy looked up, sunlight from the tall window behind Kyren fell across the table, catching the faint reflection of the tribunal's silver plaque on the polished surface. It shimmered faintly, like a new kind of lens. The window seat wasn't just taped, it became the lens through which a system saw itself. The marble plaque was already unveiled when Kyren Vallis stepped forward, his steps quiet but deliberate across the polished tribunal plaza. There was no fanfare, no cameras allowed past the front perimeter, just the crisp morning air and the gathering of men who had each, in different ways, carried a part of the weight that brought this moment into being. The silver inscription was unmissable, carved into the center of the smooth black stone. No restraint shall ever silence dignity. Kyren stood before it without speaking. He didn't need to. The silence itself felt earned, like an oath fulfilled, not just by him, but by everyone who had once been trapped by a system that called control a virtue. His reflection shimmered faintly in the polished surface behind the plaque. No ribbon cut, no applause, just presence. And it was enough. Beside him, the man from seat 2, a real name Brennick Korr, adjusted his dark blazer and exhaled softly. Now, a formally appointed public ethics officer, Brennick had played his part quietly, yet decisively. His phone had caught more than video. It had caught intention, what someone looked like when they believed power made them untouchable. He glanced toward Kyren. I never told you what I do for a living, Brennick said with a faint smile. Turns out I was in the right seat that day. Kyren gave a nod, the corner of his mouth lifting just slightly. Turns out I was to the left. Captain Velrig arrived, still in uniform despite his recent promotion to Fleet Training Commander. He paused in front of the plaque, his face unreadable. I've trained hundreds of pilots, he murmured, but that day wasn't about flying. It was about knowing when to land something before it crashes into people. Terran Halst, Aaron Tekka's tribunal liaison, now elevated to Director of Transit Compliance, joined them with measured steps. His presence was as it had always been, calm, clear-eyed, surgical in purpose. He reached into his coat pocket and placed a folded transcript on the stone base, a copy of the final tribunal ruling, signed and sealed. "For archive," he said, "for the ones who think this was just about a seat." The engineer, the Renmero, approached last. He was the one who had designed the original restraint override prototype, the one that was corrupted by Korvex Solutions without his knowledge. He hadn't spoken publicly since the tribunal, but today he carried something small, a silver pin shaped like a circuit board, its lines etched to resemble open hands instead of wire grids. He held it out to Kyren. "This wasn't what I built it for," he said, voice low, "but you showed them what it became. I just wanted to thank you for giving it purpose again." Kyren accepted the pin without a word and placed it in the inside pocket of his jacket. Across the plaza, young men in pressed dress shirts and black ties gathered, part of an ethics training seminar hosted by the Vallis Initiative. They moved in pairs and small groups, murmuring quietly as they took photos beside the glass display. Inside the case sat the original duct tape roll, worn, frayed at the edge, and now inert as any artifact of a failed age. One student leaned in and whispered to another, "They used to tape passengers?" The other responded, half in disbelief, half in reverence, "Once." And then someone taped them back. Their instructor called them away for the next session, but a few lingered, trying to commit the moment to memory before walking on. One boy, maybe 17, turned back and looked at Kyren directly, not out of curiosity, but gratitude. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The gesture said it all. The crowd began to thin, the morning sun catching in the windows of the tribunal hall. Kyren remained still. Behind the plaque, a wide panel of tempered glass reflected the square. In it, he saw them all, Rennick, Velric, Terran, the Wren, standing with him not as a protest, but as a presence. And in that same mirror, he saw himself. Not bound, not silenced, not erased. Just standing. No microphones. No statements. No podium. Just a man who had once been taped to a window seat and who had turned that restraint into reform. The wind moved slightly, rattling the leaves along the plaza walkway. Kyren's gaze held on the plaque's reflection, as if seeing it not just as an object, but as an outcome, a mirror the system had been forced to face. He didn't think of the pain anymore. He thought of the precision, the timing, the chain of choices, each small, deliberate, irreversible, that had rewired the route of the future. In the stillness, that memory didn't echo as trauma, it pulsed as clarity. A transformation not forged in defiance, but in discipline. In the mirror behind the plaque, there was no tape. Only a man, unbound, who had pulled an entire system forward. The seat was once a prison. Now it was a symbol, and it belonged to no one but the future. The CEO turned the tables, using his recordings to expose every detail in court, leaving the attacker and airline stunned. If you believe real authority turns aggression into proof and decisive justice, subscribe now, because justice always lands first. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It highlights abuse of authority, prejudice, and the power of composure and strategic documentation in confronting wrongdoing. Its purpose is to raise awareness, inspire empathy, and encourage conversations about equality, accountability, and respect for every passenger.